I have received a flood of email. I don't remember the last time Kenyans were this angry. I mean, if I shared those emails with you, hey, those emails have so much venom. It's enough to put in the petrol tank of a car, and the car moves, and the vehicle runs. Where I should not even dare be laughing. Hey, Kenyans are mad. Kenyans are livid. They just can't control their anger. And I'm sure you know why. ODM, the leading, most successful opposition party, now has some of its members in the cabinet of William Samoei Ruto. And most Kenyans just can't take it. You know, it is interesting that this has been expected for a very long time. People have been talking about a joint government since 2023. And therefore you'd have thought that this will not come as a shock to Kenyans, because they've been expecting it for a long time. But no. People are numb with shock. They can't believe it. Well, let's just dive into it and look at the possible political consequences. And in this particular case, they are rather obvious. The ODM party, kwisha maneno. Raila Amolo Odinga and his legacy, kwisha maneno. Those individuals who are very happy, they are now in cabinet. Their political careers, their political future, kwisha maneno. Including some who had such great promise, like Opio and I. Hey, you know, I don't like saying I told you so. Indeed, I hate to say that. And I don't like people who do the same. But you'll forgive me today for pointing out that we said on this channel a long time ago that you have to be careful and monitor very carefully what season you are in. This season we are in, hey, moto ya kuotea mbali sana. It is a season where one wrong move, one wrong step can bring everything crashing down. And that everything may be something that you have taken decades to put up. This is a dangerous season, because we're in the season of judgment, which comes with exposure. And I'm sure I don't need to remind you that usually exposure comes shortly before a major downfall. And it is in a season such as this one that crazy, impossible things you'd never have imagined tend to happen. Like the rise of the Gen Zs in Kenyan politics. The uprising of scrutiny over government deals. Exposés followed by scrutiny. It is not a good time to be in politics. The old politics of Kenya. The politics we have always known. And therefore these individuals should have known that by being nominated to Ruto's cabinet, the consequences will be so dire, so terrible, that it is better just to say no. It is much better. Well, we know that some of these characters have had some cases hanging over their heads. And of course, when you join cabinet, when you join government, bad things like cases tend to vanish into thin air. We know that. We also know that some of these characters were facing very tough financial times. But so what? There are so many other Kenyans going through the same. Mbona huwezi kujikaza kama mwanaume? And I don't even want to talk about Raila Odinga. please excuse me, I don't want. Because this gallant Kenyan, at the very last minute, towards the tail end of his magnificent career, indeed, people have compared Raila Odinga to legend Nelson Mandela of South Africa. And then you go and join Ruto's cabinet. Or rather, you present a list to Ruto of members of your party to join cabinet. I just feel like crying. I can sob right here. Woi. Wah! Hii Kenya yetu, Mungu saidia. But folks, my friends, let us strengthen ourselves. Let us console ourselves in those 4 very wise words in one phrase. This too shall pass. This too shall pass. Even this one, it shall pass. And maybe quicker than you think. Because you see what is happening, for those of us who are spiritual. It would appear that the Ancient of Days is doing a complete, thorough cleanup of Kenya. And is using something much more powerful than Omo and acid. Total cleanup. Indeed, that man or woman who posted a very interesting poster that read, Republic of Kenya, closed for renovations, were not far off the mark, although this is beyond renovation. It would appear that this is a total demolition of the old Kenya house, right up to the foundation. And then those old blocks are being carried away and thrown off somewhere very far. And then we are starting afresh. That seems to be what is happening. And there's something else that has happened over the last few hours. It seems that this announcement by Ruto of the rest of his cabinet has provoked imechokoza the Gen Zs. It has re-energized them and their plans. And now the message coming from the Gen Zs, in summary, is that they're going to step up their efforts. Well, they've already achieved so much. We are where we are today, courtesy of the Gen Z revolution. And so, my friends, we can also look at this as good news, because it confirms that Kenya has changed, genuine change, forever. We can never go back to the old ways, because even all the old heroes, hero politicians, hero political parties are being wiped out. Overturn. That is what is happening. And we have yet another confirmation that we are right in our assessment of what is happening in Kenya. I am sure that many of us have noticed by now a certain trend that should be very, very worrying for President William Samoei Ruto and his regime. And it is the following. Everything they try seems to backfire. Everything else they try seems not to work. In virtually every move that has been made in recent times, something has gone terribly wrong. And the perfect example of this is the expose that we all saw on KTN, a local TV station, that exposed goons financed by the Ruto regime, doing their thing. And we have to assume that this is what they have always been doing all along. Yeah, so that the government has been able to use the narrative that protests damage property, protesters loot, etc., etc. And the very latest one, that criminals infiltrate the protesters and they cause damage. That is why protests should stop. That is why the Constitution should be ignored and protests banned. Okay? Now I need to ask you a question that I will not answer immediately. Yeah, I will address it later on my show today. And the question is this. It is crystal clear, right from the days of Azimio and Raila Odinga Maandamanos last year, that there is nothing this government fears more than peaceful protests. Now my question is, why? Why do they fear them so much? Okay? I'll come back to that later. Now what went wrong on Tuesday with these goons is that, for starters, the streets were deserted. Usually they'd be full of protesters, making it more difficult for you to notice what was going down with these goons. And so they gain access into the CBD. And super fascinating, the police ignore them, which is not what they do to protesters ordinarily. And they even start snatching phones from members of the public. And still, the police do nothing, which tells you very clearly they have the instructions. They have their orders. But more importantly, this tells us, oh, kumbe this is what they usually do, undetected. But this time round, all the details are captured on video. Yeah, and the KTN do a brilliant expose where they explain everything to you in case you missed anything. Yeah, in the video clips. Very conclusive proof that Gen Z protesters are not looters and they are not criminals. And they don't destroy property, contrary to what the government is telling us officially, to what the government is telling the world officially. And one cannot help imagining that when the government told us they would end the protests, that the protests must come to an end. They promised us. The assumption is that this may have been one of the tactics they had in mind for ending the protests, for proving that the protests are just criminals, not people who are serious about the future of their country, not people who are serious about clamping down on the rampant corruption and dishonesty of our governments, yeah, both present and past. And if that is indeed true, it all backfired very badly. But even more interesting, there is something else which backfired very badly. You see, the government put so much pressure on local media houses, yeah, and put an end to live broadcasts, live coverage of the protests. The reasoning behind this is that people watch others protesting on their televisions and they get incited and they too start violent, in quotes, protests. Okay? Well, on Tuesday, something very interesting happened. Most members of our riot police spent the whole day running around in circles trying to find where the protesters were. Now obviously, this may not have happened if live broadcasts were still going on, because all they would have needed to do would have been to tune in to one of our local TV stations, even on their phones, and they would see very clearly and very quickly where most of the protesters were. But with the media blackout forced by the government, illegally, because it is unconstitutional, with that media blackout, they were all in the dark. And most of them spent a very frustrating day running all over the place and hardly finding any protesters. Because what happened in countless instances is that they would hear a report from a colleague about a certain area building up, and by the time they got there, they would find the protesters gone. Bottom line, it is clear, at least to me, that this policy of the government of not allowing live broadcasts, live coverage of the mandamanos, helped the protesters much, much more than it helped the government. What? Hey. And now we come back to that question. Why is it that everything the government tries fails? What does it mean when an individual, an organization, a government, everything they try fails? What does it mean spiritually? Because that is precisely what is happening to the Ruto regime. I'm afraid I will have to leave you to answer that question for yourself. Although some people have claimed that the Ruto regime is fighting a futile battle against an opponent one should never ever dream of fighting against. Let me just leave it at that. And now maybe I should come back to that question I had asked earlier on. It is very clear that this regime is terrified of peaceful protests. Why? I believe there are many reasons. But the reason right there at the top is that this is a government of propaganda. This is a government of floating false narratives. This is a government whose emphasis has always been on something called perception. The problem with these protests, especially when a large number of people turn up, is that it rubbishes all their narratives, rubbishes all their propaganda, especially the ones that say they are very popular. The Kenya Kwanza government is very popular. The Kenya Kwanza government genuinely won the 2022 elections. Those narratives. And this would neatly explain why the goons who entered the Nairobi CBD on Tuesday carried placards and were shouting slogans in support of the Ruto government. Give Ruto time. Give the president time. Etc. etc. Because assuming that these were ordinary Kenyans who had fueled their own motorbikes, the government would have been able to start floating the narrative that there are some people who still support this regime, that they still have a massive support base. But as we know, even that plan went terribly wrong. And instead, they were exposed. Na bado, mambo bado, tena bado sana. I am grateful, and I shall be eternally grateful for your continued support as we approach the tail end of this season of gifting Kumekucha Chris. You can see details on your screens right now, repeated in the description area below this video on YouTube and also in the comments area. Asanteni sana from the bottom of my heart. And those who are still coming, please use those details to beat the deadline. All for a better Kenya, a better tomorrow. If not for us, for our children and grandchildren. Until next time, this is Chris Kumekucha.